Hello and welcome to Glass House to Go. And it is such a great thing to be able to connect in some way or another with folks all throughout the week. But to have this time on the Sunday morning to go live and to just in a moment hopefully bring a message that's kind of been going through my heart, my mind, my life, and bringing it out, and in some way hoping that it connects also with yours as well. I always remind people that I hope it's not in a selfish way, but I just mean this is first of all a message for me. And what I mean by that is I try never to bring messages that I just say, so-and-so needs to hear this, or this would be good for, my friend over there, or that guy that I work with, or anything else. But first of all, I try to have the message mean something to me first and really come out through the experiences even that I'm going through in those moments. And so this is certainly the case in this case. This is Hebrews chapter 11. And, it's kind of interesting. Chapter 11, at least to an accounting-minded person like me or a business-minded person like me, when I hear chapter 11, I always think of bankruptcy, because, there's different businesses that declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and that's what it's called just from the tax code. But, this is kind of the opposite. This Chapter 11, maybe it declares our spiritual bankruptcy, but it offers a complete reorganization, a complete, infusion of value into our life to turn it around. And I think about that and say, like, Chapter 11 of Hebrews has to be one of the pinnacles of Scripture. There are many peaks, many wonderful highlights, certainly throughout the Bible, but this has to be one of the highest of the highlights. And so, for me, when I think about that, I slowed down in it. I don't know how you are when you travel, but sometimes I've tried, at least, not to blow by the most beautiful things, right? As you're driving by, you go, oh, look, there's, one of the seven wonders of the world, and just keep driving. And you go, wait, wouldn't it be smart to maybe pull the car over, look for a parking space, and actually spend some time in this thing? And that's what we've done with Hebrews 11. So this brings us to chapter 11, part 4, and this will be the final of these parts, but you'll see that it segues really into chapter 12, which is a continuation of the theme. And it's really the overarching thought of the book of Hebrews is it can be done. Others have done it. You can do it too. Because it was written to a group of people who were growing weary. They were growing tired. They had been through a lot already in the few moments of their newfound faith, and they were moving forward, but then against all odds, against incredible headwinds. And it just seemed like everywhere they looked, that everything was telling them, go back, go back to where it was easy. You don't need to keep pushing forward in faith. And this book is written to say it can be done. It can be done. Look, there's other people who've done it. Look at the former finishers. Look at the people who've done well and run the race well. You can do it too. There's room for you in the Hall of Faith. And so when I think about that, this to me has been a discouraging season. I'm just being, as honest as I can be about that, or transparent. I think to be at all a thinking or feeling person and to look around at the world today and say, all I see is good news. Well, that's probably not true for you. It's troubling. These are troubled times. These are troubling times. And at the same time, I need to be that person who can receive encouragement to keep pressing forward against headwinds, whatever they might be, personal or even more corporate ones, where you look around and say, man, humanity's having a time right now, right? I mean, we really need to press into what God has for us and find our best version of ourselves in God and say, like, hey, we can do better than this. We've done better against worst odds. We've pressed into God and things have progressed. And so, That's the message. You may see, if you're watching this in a visual way, over my shoulder, there's a graphic there, and it has a guy crossing a gap, running, jumping, a person there. And falling away is the letters I'm, and that was from impossible. And what's left is possible. And in a very visual way, in a very visceral way, that is kind of what I am leaning into and learning from even right now in my life, which is that anything is possible. Anything is possible. And when I think about that, I'm a guy who likes to think about probabilities, right? Sometimes I'm like, well, this doesn't look probable, but it is possible, right? And so when I think about that, the next time somebody in your life says something is impossible, I hope I can, or you can, we can mentally change that to I'm possible. Maybe I'm the solution to that problem. Maybe there's something I can do. Maybe I'm a little cog in a wheel of the world. Maybe I occupy one tiny corner, but I can be like these people who are mentioned in this chapter, somebody who serves during their time, for all time, as an example of the fact that it can be done. Where someone might have looked at any of these people and said, that's not possible, Gideon. And it's certainly not possible that Gideon is going to be the one, or Samson, or whoever. There's names mentioned in here, and some of those names mean a lot to people. Some of them maybe don't. But any one of those names, if you go back and look wider at their story, you're going to say, like, wow, it didn't look good. Probabilities weren't high for that person being a bringer of positive change. And yet, the next time someone says impossible to me, and this is impossible, or it looks impossible, especially if I'm saying it to myself, maybe I could think, well, if I'm possible, I guess it's possible. Because really, I don't know a ton about science, but I know enough to know that I'm fairly improbable. I'm a loosely held collection of molecules and things like that are like these impossibly complex DNA strands that go back to the impossibility of ancestors and all kinds of things. And here I am, right? I mean, like, how I am even here seems pretty impossible to me if I really think about it honestly. And so I think, well, if I'm possible, I guess it's possible. Anything's possible. I live in a world of everyday impossibilities. And so again, when you think about this, here's what I want to think on with you. It's not just like some blind faith. It's not just some kind of hopeful thinking. It's not, faith in faith. It's faith in some very specific things, in some very specific directions. It's not just blindly closing your eyes and jumping a gap. It's saying, well, let's look at how this has happened and what has happened in history and how that's played out. And so again, this is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 to 40. It's the last few verses, but again, there's so much in this and so much that went before. So I hope you'll go back and listen to those if you haven't already. Take a look at this later, because again, I'm just barely scratching the surface of what is here in these verses. But I like this quote that I came across this week. I've known it before, but I saw it again, and it came at such a great time. And it's from a man named Nelson Mandela, and I hope you know of him. And if you don't, go look him up and learn from his life. But he's a guy who faced impossible things and dreamed impossible dreams that came true, but he lived through some nightmares on the ways to that dream as well. A perfect person? No, there is no such thing, but certainly a person who you could say, well, it's possible because I'm possible. He basically said it always seems impossible until it's done. I'm sure there were so many people in his life that when he would lay out a vision of the way he thought things should be or could be or would be, maybe even, they'd say, well, that's nice thinking there, Nelson, but that's impossible. And then, yet you can look in the history books and see things accomplished that people said were impossible to accomplish, and they are done. And again, there's still work to be done, of course, but things that people would have said, you won't even get that far. He got that far. And so I think about it, it always seems impossible until it's done. How many things in human history were deemed just not even within the realm of possibility. And then you say, well, until someone did it. See, I think about this again. The graphic I have up here is a plaque, and that on that plaque is the story of a person, or the recognition of a guy with the last name Bannister, but he was in 1954 that he broke a barrier that people had before that said, I don't think that's humanly possible, and that was to break the 4-minute mile. Now, again, I might break the 4-minute mile in a car, right? But he did it running. And here's what's fascinating about it to me, which is prior to him breaking that barrier, no one in recorded history that they knew of had broken that barrier, right? I mean, it was just like, well, it's not possible. And then he did it, and guess what? Within a month, someone else did it. And since that time, at least, there are documented 1,500 people who've done it since the 50s. And there's people who've done even more than he did. There's a guy who actually did 2 4-minute miles in a row. So he broke the 8-minute barrier for a 2-mile race. And you go like, man, to do it once, but to keep doing it and do it on it, you go like, I don't know. Yeah, and that's just one example. But the point of it is that once somebody did it, more people did it. And I've thought about that in my life, that I've been maybe able to look at some ththings that I said, well, I don't know how you could ever do that. And then I see someone do it. And there's areas of my life where I'm always a student, I hope. You know, I guess some people call me a Bible teacher or just a teacher in other areas of life. And I suppose I have some things to share, but I also have so much more to learn. And you know, one of the areas is I play the drums. And there's things that I go, man, that's just not even possible. And then I'll listen to someone do it and I go, how is that happening? They're doing some kind of studio trick. And then I watch them and they share a technique with me, or they show something. They say, oh, if you twist your wrist this way, you'll get double the speed. And I try it and I go, well, I ain't as fast as they are, but I'm faster than I was just a minute ago. And you realize that when somebody breaks a barrier, it emboldens you to say, well, maybe it is possible. I thought before this it wasn't possible, but maybe it is. And that's what I think this chapter has been to me and can be to us, which is a crazy thought, but it's a crazy thought. If we miss it, it's even crazier to miss this, because God said, hey, it's not impossible. Scott, if you're possible, it's possible. If I can do something with you, if I can create you, I can certainly put you on this planet, but I put you on this planet and I can plan it in such a way that, as impossible as it seems, you might actually have a reason for existing. That you might have an influence on history. And so when I think about that, there's room in the hall of faith for your name too, for my name too, for our name on this. And I love the way it starts here as a chapter. I want to get into it because there's so much in it, but I hope you'll jump to this thought. And again, I'm not ignoring the news that's all around. In fact, it's the very impossibility of making a change in either my world or the world that sometimes drives me back to needing this kind of encouragement. That I turn on the news and I look at cities burning and lockdowns and progress I thought we'd make being unraveled in front of me, and people, hate seeming to spread so quickly and love just seeming to be so far behind. And you go like, what are we going to do? What am I going to do? Is it even possible for there to be an improvement? Are there better days ahead, or are the better days all behind? And I go, well, man, let me return to these thoughts here. See, this is what the chapter says. This is what the Bible says in here. I want you to think about it. I want to think about it. It says, what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about blank. Now, I put it blank because they go on to some names that we're about to look at now. But I mean, what they're basically saying is, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough parchment paper. I'm going to run out of room to give you all the amazing examples I could give you. I'm just giving you a small, tiny, itty-bitty sample out of human history of some people that faced impossible odds with the God of the impossible. And guess what? It's done. The record is in the book, right? People said that you can't do that, Gideon. And he did it. God won't use you, Samson. You're a wreck. And you know what? God used him. And then you look at the list and you go, well, God filled in the blank, and you say, well, we're going to run out of time. This is what I wrote down. We will run out of time before we will run out of examples of God doing the impossible through people. And so again, I just it has to stop my mouth. Like when my mouth starts running, right? And it can. When my mind starts running toward, well, it's impossible, you know? Maybe I have a goal of seeing something improve and it hasn't improved. And again, these things can be tiny little things in the world history. It might be that I had a business thought or an idea or an approach or maybe a personal relational goal, or I was going to change, or I was hoping that situation might change. And I go, well, it's not looking probable. It's looking downright impossible. It's impossible. And I throw up my hands, and this is what this chapter is saying. It's saying, you know what? I couldn't possibly give you all the examples there are of someone who might have seen things the same way, but they kept going and they found that the barrier did get broken. They found that the impossible was possible, and that with God, things that looked unlikely, and candidates that looked unlikely, and people who looked like the last person you would pick if you were looking for, trying to do something impossible, you go, well, there's room for me in that story, because I'll run out of time before I'll run out of examples. And I've thought about this many times. A lot of times in my life, I'm looking for more proof or more data. And I think this was part of the lesson for me. I hope it helps you. I hope it means something to you. But this is what I wrote, which is, we don't need to see more proof. We need to be more proof. What I mean by that is, God doesn't need to show me another example somewhere in some verse in the Bible about somebody he used way back then, while I sit there and read that and go, yeah, well, okay, I'm still collecting, data to make sure that God can really do the impossible. You go, how do I need any more proof? I don't need to see any more proof. I need to be some more proof. I need to go live out these things in my life. I don't necessarily need to soak more in. I need to, in some ways, pour more out. Because at some point, I'm going to run out of time in my life. I don't really need to see the stories so much of other people accomplishing great things with their life, but I just need to believe on some level that I've got enough evidence right here. I've collected plenty of examples and could collect many more, but I don't want to collect dust and rust in my life when really God's just saying, get out there and do it. Because if I'm possible, it's possible. And not because of my possibilities, but because I happen to believe in the God of the impossible. I am, by my own estimations, impossible. God's already done things that defy my understanding, that are bigger than I dreamed and went beyond anything that I thought. And so here I am thinking, well, I'm facing a new challenge. And I go, but that's not possible. And you go, no more impossible than that other thing that happened over there, didn't it? And so when I think about that, I really don't need to see a lot more evidence from God. But I think the world needs to see a little more evidence from me, of God in me, if that makes any sense. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like when I look at a guy who could break the barrier, the 4-minute mile back in 1954, he probably had some pretty crummy equipment. I'm just saying that. And that's part of the metaphor that really Hebrews is even talking about. It's like, my goodness, these guys in the Old Testament had Old Testament understandings in some ways. And here I am with the New Testament. I've got all of their examples too, all of the evidence of their life. I've got so much more than they do. There's no real reason for me to believe that God can do less with my life now than he did with their life then. How could it be? I got better equipment. I'm better equipped. The Bible says we're spiritually equipped, right? So I got better equipment. I got better shoes of faith to run in than they did. But let's look at some of their names real quickly. Maybe you'll recognize some, maybe you won't. But we won't go into them because the author said, I don't have time to really give you more details than let me just throw out some names here. He says, how about Gideon? Remember Gideon? The guy who said, I'm hiding from the enemy. And they said, you are the mighty man of valor that will lead everyone into victory. And you go, I'm in personal defeat right now. Barak, Samson, Jephthah. What about David and Samuel and just lumps in, the prophets? We could profit from looking at their life, but he just kind of like sums them all together here. And what happened in their life? Well, again, it's a pretty encouraging story. It says through faith, remember, it's through faith and not faith in themselves. This was not Gideon's faith in Gideon. This was God's faith in Gideon and Gideon's faith in God, right? This was God believing in these people. Not just that, they believed in God, but I think it's a massive revelation to realize that God believes in me. You go, well, he knows how impossible things are. Even the easy stuff can't be done by me, but there's nothing that God couldn't do through my life if he so desires. And so I look at that and say, God believes in me. I believe in God. That's quite a combo here. And it says these are the things that happened through faith. They conquered kingdoms. They administered justice. Oh man, justice. That's a good thing. To say that you're a person of faith and not think that justice matters. Wow, they administered justice. They gained what was promised. This is good. Hey, this is progress, man. Gain, conquer, administer, justice. I like all these things. These are very encouraging words. It says they shut the mouths of lions. You go, well, that's not possible. I don't even want to find out if that's possible, right? But read the stories, they shut the mouths of lions. People threw them in the lion's den and no lion. They got out of there. Quenched the fury of the flames. This is people who says they didn't even smell like smoke. They got, someone tried to burn them. And hey, what a burn. They didn't burn. You think about this, they escaped the edge of the sword. It's like, whoop, 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 woo, 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 whoops, whoa. What else you got? And you think about that and you go back and watch the footage and you go, that's not even possible. How did that guy do that? And it's like, they escaped the edge of the sword. I see seemingly impossible things done all the time. But then look at this too. Their weakness was turned to strength. I like this because it's like their weakness, God said, oh man, it's the very impossibility of it that makes me want to get involved with it. Because at the end, guess who's going to get the glory? It's not going to be, Gideon. Remember Gideon's army? I just want to, take a look at it later. But he's the guy who conquered, that God kept whittling down the group with him. He's like, the problem right now is you got too many people around you. And they'll get the glory if you win. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to whittle down the odds to make it even more impossible. And that's when it gets possible. I love it. It says they became powerful in battle and they routed foreign armies. I mean, it was like things that the odds makers, the bet layers, what is it? This one doesn't look good for y'all. And you say, well, God's odds are different than that, aren't they? And so verse 35 of Hebrews 11, this is an amazing verse. And if this were the only verse in the chapter, it would do two things for me. First of all, it would make me very, very excited, but it'd also make me very, very discouraged because real life is not only found in verse 35. This is what's possible. Look at it. It says, women received back their dead, raised to life again. And you go, all right, well, that's today's lessons, folks. Thanks for tuning in to Glass House to Go. Right there, I'd actually be mad. I'd be like, yes, God, that's great, but that's not my tomorrow. That's not my today. I actually didn't have verse 35 happen. I even believed that that would be what would happen. And I kept believing that would happen. And I believed my relationship would come back from the dead, or my business would come back from the dead, or my health would come back from the brink or whatever. And you go, but I didn't get that. And you go, well, that's because that's not the end of the story. See, again, this is part of the story. But I think this is so important. This, of all verses probably that are defining of at least my faith walk and what I've tried to both talk and walk with people, is the reality that verse 35 is one possibility among others. That I go like, hey, I like this one. I like this one a lot. And I believe it. I believe this with all my heart, that there are people who the resurrection is part of their story, their personal story, where they're like, you know what? There was somebody who was in a coma for a year and completely unresponsive. And people said, this is it. It's done. There's no hope here at all. And they said, well, I still have hope. And that hope turned into a reality in their real life and defied every expert's thought, which means, you know what? No matter what a person says, no matter how expertise laden they may be, I say, well, that's interesting, but I don't know what God wants to do in this case. But that is not the whole story. In some ways, I kind of wish it was, but since I'm living a different story, I'm glad it's not. I'm glad it keeps going. See, this is what it says. This might be some of the possibilities too, and I wrote it down this way, and I hope you'll chew on it. I hope you'll make sure that it's a part of what you really believe, which is beware of faith, quote unquote, that only believes in the preferred possibilities. I know people who say, well, I don't want to hear that negative talk, or I don't want to look at that situation because I believe better things than that. And I'm like, oh, hey, I believe better things than that too, but I believe other things than that too. I am what I call a hopeful realist. And what I mean by that is I don't have to deny the possibility that things could go very south in my life. I don't have to deny that my health or wealth or anything else could be at an all-time low and go to the most unthinkable spots. I could go through any form of suffering, and that doesn't invalidate for a moment the incredible possibilities that God has promised to me, both here and later. See, not every promise of God is going to be fulfilled while I yet live and breathe in this body. And I think that's super important to know. I mean, that's exactly what this chapter talks about, because moving on in this chapter, this is what it says. There were others. So notice this. There's some mothers who received their dead back to life, but there were other mothers who didn't. There were those who were tortured, and they refused to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. What is this talking about? Well, it's talking about the fact that suffering in itself is not rewarded. The point is this. They were able to be released by denying and turning from the thing that they believed in. There's almost always an opportunity to go the easy way, to go and say like, well, hey, if I lie about this or I go this way, I might get out of some suffering. And this is what they were saying. There were people being tortured for their faith. There were people being, mistreated for their belief. It happens yet today, right? And there was an escape route. The escape route was, well, just stop believing this. Stop behaving this way. Stop standing for what you actually know to be true. And they said, well, no, can do. I refuse it. Hey, you can leave this prison right now. All you have to do is admit that Jesus is nobody to you and nothing to you. And they said, no, can't do it, won't do it. God, I'd rather go through a worse experience here on earth. And there's a reward in heaven. There's a reward in heaven for faithfulness. There's a reward in heaven for things that you might have been mistreated for here on earth. The Bible says God will treat you for that stuff and say like, hey, good job. That wasn't easy, man. You took the hard road. But here's the reward for that. Here's the thank you for that. Here's the good and faithful servant for that. And I think that's really important to realize that my experience here on earth is not the end of the story on my life or anyone's life. So again, there's going to be times where I think about this, verse 36. Look, it says some faced jeers. Now I think about what a jeer is. A jeer and flogging. If somebody said, Scott, would you rather be jeered or flogged? Well, I'll take jeering. I would. I mean, it's like, sticks and stones may break my bones and words will never hurt me and stuff. But, words have hurt me quite a bit. Words can hurt you quite a bit. The fact is, jeers and flogging are both in there together because God recognizes that not every pain is a physical pain. I mean, the truth is, it is an incredibly difficult thing to have the disapproval of people who you go like, man, I don't know how it's possible to keep pressing on and leaning into something when I'm being ridiculed for that at every turn. And you go, that's a big enough deal that God puts it in the same sentence as chains and imprisonment. And I think about that many times. I know people who seriously say, man, I would rather you punch me than say what you just said to me. That hurt more than a gut punch. I mean, that is more devastating to me to have your disapproval or whatever else than it is. Man, a stranger could have slapped me and it would have hurt less than that. And this is what I see in these things. I love it. It's talking about people who faced a lot of stuff through faith. They were put to death by stoning, it says there. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. Did you notice that just a few verses earlier, it says they escaped the edge of the sword by faith, and here it says they were cut in two by the edge of the sword by faith? See, this is really important to me. I think about it all the time, and just collapsing this thought into something so portable, I think about it all the time. It says some received their dead back, some were sawn in two, but it's the same faith. What does that mean? Faith doesn't guarantee a specific preferred outcome. That's what I was saying. It doesn't. It accepts all possibilities. When I think about it, God is the God of the impossible, but that means, you know what? There's nothing that I can say, well, that's impossible. God wouldn't allow that. God wouldn't allow that difficulty into my life. God wouldn't let that happen to this person. You go, you know what? Actually, in life, all things are possible. There's times where I look at the injustice and the wrongness of situations and I go, I just wouldn't have even thought it was possible that things could go that way, that something that bad could happen to somebody that good. But I've walked through these things and I've realized that faith has to embrace the possibilities. But the possibilities of turnarounds, the possibilities that my story, maybe the sawed in two story of one person is the very thing that allows somebody to go through something else, something similar, something worse, and say, well, you know what? They believed till the very end. They believed through that. And so I think about it many, many times. I would truly rather be the verse 35 person, right? That, Scott believed and all of his dreams were resurrected and all of the things taken from him ever and all of the mistreatment he ever had in real life or in even perception or all the injustices that he wanted to be just and be turned around, those things all turned around in his lifetime and he got to see it with his own eyes. You go, well, I'd like to be that guy. But there's times where God says, would you be willing to be part of the other part of this? The ones who maybe went through some horrific things so that others could look and say, man, they went through that horrific thing, but they didn't lose faith. They didn't lose hope. They didn't lose belief in the betterness of things, even when they saw and experienced the worst that people were possible of doing. See, I love that in other people. I admire that in other people. I see that and I go, oh, wow, what an accomplishment that person's life was. And you go, yeah, but I don't know if I want to be that guy, God. Use my life, God, but don't let anyone abuse my life, God. You know, you know what I'm saying? It says they went around in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute. They were persecuted. They were mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. And I'm not in any way including my name in this list of people. There are people who, frankly, we may share the same faith, but I would be embarrassed in some ways, honestly, to stand beside them and have some people in eternity say, man, we went through some tough times to follow Jesus, didn't we? And I'd go, yeah, had to sit alone at the lunch table twice. Yeah, it was pretty rough. And again, I'm not minimizing anyone's suffering. Suffering is suffering, but I can at least make fun of my own, right? On the list of in the Hall of Faith, if there's room for my name in there and I break any barriers, it'll be maybe that a guy had so many reasons to be a softie, and somehow he rose up and managed to tough out a few tough times. And maybe that was an encouragement to someone to say, well, a guy that soft made it through a few hard times. But honestly, this is me just talking. I've kind of, this season has been one where I'm like, man, a couple times I've said like, I can't take it anymore, right? I can't do it anymore. You know, I just, whatever it is, whatever the big it is in your life where, you know, I can't stand it anymore. I can't stand trying to stand for justice or stand for compassion or stand for hope or stand for belief or stand for faith or stand for God or stand for, you know, the truth or any of these things or stand with this and just seeing things crumble so often that you've worked so hard for, or you see something that, you know, buildings burn, so to speak, that somebody worked so hard to build. And you say, the world isn't worthy of that stuff, man. I just can't take it anymore. I can't do it anymore. And this is where you go, well, remember, I have to come back to some real basic thoughts here. If I think something's impossible, I got to remember I'm possible. I got to remember you're possible, and I got to remember that if people have gone through a lot more than I've gone through and done it. So I'm like, there's a part where I look at any name. I can pick a name from this chapter, or I can pick a name from my own life's experience and say, man, if not for any other reason, can I just simply look over and say, well, gosh, that person has gone through so much more than I have. Can I take it for them? Can I take it to show them that here they are trying to, I'm trying to just get out and take a 18-minute walk, and they're trying to break a 4-minute mile. Can I at least not give up in my lane so that they don't give up in theirs? I mean, can I at least help them maybe look over and go, well, that guy's pretty slow. At least I'm not that slow. You know, maybe I can be an encouragement to someone else simply because I'm such a duffer, you know, where they look at him and go, well, gosh, Scott ain't got much in the tank and he's still going. So maybe I got more than that. Maybe God's got more than that for me. You know, and I think about some very simple things like that. I remember somebody telling me once that proving the impossibility of something is impossible, because what you have to prove is that not only has it never been done under the conditions that we understand, but it can never be done anywhere under any conditions. That's the true definition of impossible. Not just that I didn't find it possible in my realm of experience or with my understanding, but I have to make a declaration that nowhere in any possible planet and universe anywhere is something even within the realm of maybe. And you go like, man, I can't declare impossibility, but you know what I need? Possibility is so much easier to believe. I believe in the possibility. Why? All I need is one example somewhere, anywhere. One example proves the possibility. And maybe you think back to the quote, I think it's a great one, about the development of the light bulb. And they were like, are you starting to believe this is impossible? And it's like, no, I have proved 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb, but I have yet to, I'm just getting closer to the way to make one. And every time we turn on the light, we are doing something with a light switch that people said was impossible for most of human history. And yet one person or one group of people or a group of people that maybe will remain nameless and someone else got the credit. But along the way, there were people who kept saying, I think this is possible. All we've proved yet is we haven't done it yet. And so I look at things and sometimes I think, man, is it possible? Is it possible for people to look past skin color and love one another? Is it possible? And you go, well, we've had glimpses of it for little times, but maybe it just hasn't happened yet. See, and when I think about the book of Hebrews, the thing to remember is the Jew and Gentile thing that Jesus came to reconcile. If you've missed that one, that's one of the major messages of the Bible, is that the two most impossible relationships to mend, if you could have thought of them, was holy God and unholy people. And then because people are imperfect, there's so much impossibility to loving your neighbor. And so the entirety of the Bible's message is that you would love God and love your neighbor, right? If you could give the cliff notes to it. And that just seemed, if you look across history, gosh, it seems like sometimes people have used their love of God as an excuse for their hatred of people. And you look at it and go, could Jesus do that? And you go, well, maybe you just haven't seen it yet. But I've seen little glimpses of it. I've seen people who the world wasn't worthy of them. They were mistreated and misunderstood and everything else. And you go, but they just kept treating people right, even when they were mistreated in themselves. And you go, they were persecuted, but instead of becoming cynical and sinful and hateful, they just redoubled their efforts and said, maybe it's possible. Maybe it's possible that someone would see something in me that would inspire them and barriers would be broken. And maybe not even in my lifetime, but maybe because of my lifetime and the time I spent doing this, I can keep plugging on this. And maybe someone would look later and say, you know who gave me the courage to keep running my race? The guy who kept running his race. And I would want nothing more than for the people who come after me and us to be better than us. And we got to do better. We got to do better. And there's times where I look at the young people and certainly in my own family and the friends of our kids and things. And I go, y'all are better. Y'all are better than we are. You got to do better. We got to be better. But I'm hopeful in some way they saw that something that they said, well, God, Scott, my dad, my friend, my influence, my pastor, my whatever, he never threw in the towel and said it's impossible and what's the point? He kept in his life, in his race, in spite of things that set back. He said, well, I still believe there could be better days ahead for us. And I will work toward those things. I can take it anymore. I will take it anymore. And if there's even people who don't appreciate or misunderstand steps I took, where I'm like, why are you mad at me? I'm trying to work toward a better day. Why are you mad at me? Why are you hurling insults at me? That instead of pushing back on that, I just say, you know what? I get it. I get your frustration, man. I get it. See, I think about this. I've wanted to give up many times and I've faced less. And so I think about this. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. He's describing in the book of Hebrews people who went through worse and kept believing for better days. And I look at that and I go, we don't have to accept things the way they are. We have to keep saying, this is unacceptable. I'm going to work toward, I'm going to believe toward, I'm going to walk toward, I'm going to talk toward better things because I believe there's a better possibility than I've even seen. That it may have seemed impossible to this point, but that's all that means. All it means is it's been impossible so far. But do I believe that there's better possibilities? Yes, I believe in better possibilities. And see, when I think about this, they were all commended for their faith, yet not one of them, none of them received what had been promised. I want you to soak in. We're going to stop right there. You can see it on the screen or you can look at it later. Hebrews 11:39. I want you to think about this, the depth of what's being said here, because it says, these were all commended for their faith. Like, hey, good job. Good belief, man. The way you were believing and the way you be living were great. And they were commended for something. But notice this. None of them got what they had been promised. You say, but there were people who got their child back to life, but they'd been promised more than that. See, they didn't even get everything they'd been promised. Some people got sawn in two, and you go, yeah, they didn't get what they'd get promised. No, they got exactly what they'd been promised. In this world, you will have trouble, but fear not. I've overcome the world. See, here's the whole deal. No matter how well or non-well it goes for me in this life, I have not received what God has promised to me. I haven't. I will never. If I live to be 105 and see with my own eyes a life of peace where people from all different, circumstances in life can get along, and you go like, it's still not the heaven that has been promised to me and to you and to all. There isn't anything on this earth that could ever live up to the promise that God has for me. And so sometimes when I am going through this and I say, I can't take it anymore, you go like, Scott, what did I promise you? I promised you eternity, and you so far have got 53 of those years under your belt. And most of them, frankly, it's been a pretty nice belt. Occasionally it's been challenging and all the rest of that, but come on now. You've had to let that belt out sometimes because of how well fed you've been or how well things have gone. I mean, seriously. And so I think about that and I go, all right, but I can point to some people who haven't had that experience. And you go like, what are you doing about it, Scott? Well, the first thing I'm going to do about it maybe is spend less time complaining about how hard my path is and make sure I'm running that path faithfully, but that I'm also encouraging others, reaching out to others and saying, hey, that's a rockier road than I've had to walk on. Let me think about how I can maybe take some of the rocks out of your path or some of the hurdles out of your way, or maybe I can use some of the abilities I have or the laps I've taken to look over and see somebody struggling in their lane and see if I can do something about this. See, this is what I think about. I think about it a lot. This chapter, it said they had not been promised. What had been promised? What's been promised to you? What's been promised to me? Well, I know one thing that's never been promised by God to me, which is that I would have it easy. He never said that. Scott, don't worry, man. I got it. I got an easy way for you to go. What he promised was that it would be worth it. But notice it says here that the world was not worthy of the people who were going through it by faith. This world is not going to be worth the faith you have, but the world to come is going to be worth the faith you had. What had been promised? See, I think about this again. What had been promised? More. What has been promised to you? Here's what's been promised. More. More than you can ask, think, or imagine. You go, so I'm going to ask, think, and imagine stuff. And God says, okay, I'm going to do more than that, which means sometimes he's going to do different than that. So I might ask for an easy road. And he says, I'm going to do more than that. I might ask for a quick victory. And he says, I'm going to actually do more than that. I might ask for an answer here on earth. And he says, I'm actually going to do more than that. I'm going to do more than you ask, so I have to do different than you're asking. So I can imagine things, and I just realize that no matter how much I ask, think, or imagine, God's promised more. which means sometimes I'm going to think he delivered less. I'm like, you delivered less. And he said, no, I'm delivering more, more than you could have asked, thought, or imagined. What's been promised? Again, so much has been promised, but so much different. Notice verse 40. Here's verse 40. Think on this with me. It says, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Only together with us? What does that mean? That means a guy like Gideon, his story isn't the whole story. It means that there are things that in eternity, Gideon will be able to look at my life and say, yeah, you learned something from me, but I learned something from you. And you're like, really? I mean, my puzzle piece created part of the puzzle of what God was doing? Yeah. There were things that were not, the story wasn't over when it was like, well, there's the story of David and the prophets, and let's just sew it up there. You go, nope. There was more to be written, and there were things that they didn't understand in their lifetime that they can only understand by looking at my lifetime. Only looking at what God is doing now. Through the lens of eternity, the Bible says, we'll understand fully as we're fully understood, which means when I hit the finish line of my life, there's going to be things that I thought that was the finish line. I thought that was the point. And I go like, oh, you mean that wasn't the point? That whole thing that I thought was the point and I thought was such a big deal wasn't the big deal. And it's like, no, that wasn't the big deal, actually. That wasn't it. And so I wrote down this way, no soul story, no solo story tells the whole story, right? No one person's life tells everything. I need the people next to me. I need the people that I haven't met. I need the Nelson Mandela's lives to inform my life. That I might look at it and say, well, I didn't go through what he went through, but he went through what he went through. Could I learn from his life and have maybe a little more compassion on people who have gone through things that I don't even know if I could have gone through that. I don't know if I would have gone through that. And you go, well, yeah, like, so maybe they're better. Maybe they're tougher. Maybe they're stronger. Maybe they admitted a weakness you didn't, and maybe they allowed God to work in their life in a way you haven't yet. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. That doesn't mean it's not possible, because if they're possible, I'm possible. And if it's possible in their life, it's possible in my life. But no soul story tells the whole story. And so again, when I think about that, what does it mean? It means I can look at these things and I can learn from these things. It means that if somebody says to me, Scott, it's impossible, it's always been this way, it'll always be this way, you know, I mean, inequity and injustice and wrongness, you know, it's going to be out there. There's nothing you can do to change it. And your efforts to change it are hollow or hypocritical or whatever. And you go, well, okay, let me just throw up my hands and throw in the towel and give up. No, I'm not going to do that. Because if it's possible, I'm possible. I'm possibly the person who could make a big change in this, or maybe I'm just a asterisk to history, that I'm the person that was mistreated and misunderstood and never really felt like they got accomplished the things they wanted to accomplish. And maybe someone stepped on that step on their way to an accomplishment. But guess what? If I'm possible, you're possible, we're possible, it's possible. It's possible because God said it was. It's possible because God said, with me, all things are possible. And so things I haven't seen yet doesn't mean they won't be there. And I don't really need to see any more examples, but I need to be an example in my time, in my way, so that I don't drop the ball when it's my run. And that's exactly what Hebrews 11 and 12 talks about. You know, that maybe there's one person somewhere that I don't even know is looking to me for an example and saying, well, if God can do it in Scott, I mean, maybe God could do it in me. Because I had people in my life that they didn't know, maybe, that I was looking at them and I was saying, well, gosh, if they can keep going through this with such a positive attitude, maybe it's possible for me to think a little differently than I do. And so I would encourage you to go through Hebrews 11. The world needs people that it's not worthy of. The world needs people who believe there's something better out there even when things get worse. The world needs someone who steps up even when people step out. The world needs someone who keeps taking whatever steps they can at whatever pace they can, even knowing, hey, I am not the whole solution. I'm not maybe even the problem, but I simply am going to be a person who says anything is possible. And if it's possible, and if it's desirable, then God, it's possible you want to use me. And I'm never again going to let a gap between what I see in my own life or in other people's life convince me that we've got to stay on this side of what God would want to do and say, like, maybe this is the generation that gets it right. Maybe this is the time that it finally gets bad enough, that it gets good enough, that people will say, I have to change. Not looking over at you and saying, you need to change, but I will be the change that I want to see. Because I've already seen the change in other people. I've already seen what God can do. I've seen how evil people are possible. And I've also seen how much people can rise above and through the worst of the worst that people have to dish out. And see, sometimes it's just turning things a little bit. I'll close with this. My wife and I learned so much from her, but just even this week, we had to get a mattress up a staircase, and it was just the two of us. And I kind of looked at it and said, I don't know if it's possible. But here's the thing. I started kind of yanking on it, pushing on it, and there was a place where the ceiling was here and the steps were there, and it just, I was like, we're gonna just push it on through. And Lynn said, I think it's a little bit narrower the other way. And I thought the thing was a perfect square, but it wasn't. It turns out that there's a 3-inch difference on the mattress that I didn't notice and I didn't know about. And I could have fought that and said, I know what I'm doing. I'm pushing through it. And that's kind of my way in some ways, I got to admit. But I was like, you know what? I'm going to believe you that I can't see it for myself, but you know something I don't. And we turned it, and that little turn turned everything. It was still very difficult to get up the stairs, but it's up the stairs and it's through that spot. And it was successful. It was possible. What I was just coming to the realization, it's impossible. And my wife was able to see it a little different and say, it could turn a little bit, and maybe that little bit is enough to make a difference. It's still going to be difficult. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be worth it. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be worth it. So remember, next time you're thinking that God is the God of the impossible, that means that no outcome is impossible. Things could go very difficult for me. I could be the person who is in the verse that I don't want to be in. But ultimately, in the story of God, I have to believe all possibilities. And just because I haven't seen it yet doesn't mean I'm not going to see it. I may see it here on earth. That's a possibility. I may see it from a great seat in eternity and say, well, I didn't see it then, but I see it now. You are the God of the impossible. And if I'm possible, it's possible. If you're possible, it's possible. If we're possible, it's possible. So don't give up. Don't give in. A barrier that you break may be the very thing that emboldens somebody who comes after you to go so much further and faster and better than you did. It's not up to you to break every record in human history. It's just simply to you and to me to run our race with faith and knowing that even if we fall, even if we fail, we won't fail to at least be the inspiration to somebody who says, with God's help, I will and can be better. I can do different. And that's what these names are to me. They are people that some of them say, I think I can do better than that with God's help. And there's other people I go, I don't think even with God's help, I could get that far. But let's see. It's possible. It's possible. I'm possible. You're possible. It's possible. God bless you guys.